So hopefully you've watched the video by now. What we're going to do is think about how Spielberg, and I'm going to refer to Spielberg as the artist on this, even though obviously every film is a collaborative project. He's the guy in charge. So what was Spielberg trying to do with the use of color in this particular part of what is otherwise a black and white image? Essentially, he was trying to control what the viewer was going to look at. And so he was using emphasis or creating a focal point to have a tie to the viewer. When we're looking at this still, which is essentially what film clip starts with, we've got that guy from Star Wars, also known as Liam Neeson, who is playing Schindler, who in the movie, if you haven't seen it, starts off as essentially a war profiteer. He has figured out that if he uses Jewish labor for his military and governmental contracts, he can, by law, pay them less, and therefore he can underbid everybody else, and therefore he can get rich. So his whole purpose of having any relationship with the Jewish community in the beginning of the movie is because he wants to exploit them as a cheap labor force. Over the course of the movie, his disposition changes as he starts to see Jewish people as, people, and is then going to start to work in the exact opposite way, which is that he's going to start spending his own personal fortune in an attempt to protect as many people as he can. This is the super crass Cliff Notes version of the plot of the movie. What we're seeing in the girl with the red coat clip, or the girl in red section, as this is often referred to, is him becoming aware of the atrocities that are being visited upon the Jewish community. We start with this, and we have a clear focal point, and it's his gorgeous, gorgeous face. But we also have what we're going to define as accents. An accent, in terms of emphasis, is an area of secondary interest. So we've got his brooding, ruggedly handsome face, but we also have things within the composition that might have visual weight that would attract our attention as well. The Nazi pin that he ostentatiously is wearing upon his lapel is a good example of an accent, and it's there as a signifier. He's using it as a symbol to ingratiate himself with the powers that be in the film. We also have the oh so subtle symbolism of the giant dead tree, which in this composition is used to provide balance, but also is an accent. It's something that we would look at. When we look at the rest of the film, what we're going to see is that Spielberg is using color to highlight this one little girl who is walking everywhere in this scene. What's happening is that the German army and the SS are clearing out the Jewish ghetto as a precursor to moving them into concentration camps, and various atrocities occur. And Spielberg is using the girl in the red as a way to get us to stay engaged with the film. One of the things that I think is particularly interesting about the challenge he has is that Spielberg is trying to create an accurate depiction of the kinds of horrors that happened in the Holocaust. But if he does too good of a job, we're going to emotionally shut down. We're going to stop interacting with the film, and we're going to just sort of push ourselves away in a protective manner. We don't want to watch people get their lives destroyed. We don't want to watch people murdered. And so to keep us engaged, he gives us a really clear focal point, the girl in red. It's the only thing in color. We can also see, for instance, at the beginning when we first see her, she's isolated in the chaos of the street scene. We can see the way in which he's using movement. She'll either work against the grain or with the grain of the movement, depending on where we are. It's a well-composed sequence visually, but conceptually what he's trying to do is give us something that we are concerned about, because it is not her fault. There is nothing this girl could have done to deserve this kind of treatment. And therefore, we are establishing a clear one-to-one relationship between the empathy that we feel for this girl and the emotional content that Spielberg is trying to communicate. It was not the Jews' fault. It is something where we want to think about them as human beings, as individuals, and as a community. And that's ultimately what's happening with Schindler as he is starting to realize that exploiting people just to get rich is maybe not something that he wants to continue. What we're seeing then is the way in which Spielberg keeps us engaged, especially because when we shift from scene to scene within the extended clip, we immediately start looking for the girl in red. We want to make sure that she's still okay, that we can find her. So we're actively engaged with the film, but also he's very strategic in the way in which very terrible atrocities happen either right before or right after she moves through a space. And so we are therefore left with, for instance, nothing to look at other than the horror of German efficiency and loading people up to use one bullet to kill many people. What we get then is a fairly common technique, which is to use a really strong, clear focal point with the intention of using it as a way to grab the viewer and get them to engage with the work. So in this case, not only is there one focal point, but there's also one focal point that connects directly to the content intended. We can see that this is a technique that has been used throughout art history. In this case, Goya's 3rd of May, a reaction to the subjugation of Spanish people by the French in the Napoleonic era. We have, again, a really clear single strong focal point. We know whose side we're on. We're definitely intended to empathize with the figure in white here. He is the focal point for a number of formal reasons. He's the lightest value other than, say, the lantern, but it's really hard for me to have a conversation with a lantern, so I'm not as emotionally invested in lanterns. Plus, it's covered up by the leg of the French soldier. So we've got a value contrast. We've got a color contrast. He's really the only warm figure that we've got. We've got these fabulous yellow pants. We've got a really dynamic pose, which is obviously also telling us whose side we're on, because it's pretty clearly a reference to the sacrifice of Christ on the cross in the crucifixion, just like this guy is being sacrificed for Spain's ultimate freedom as the French are currently oppressing them. What we also see is that this is one of the few faces that we can see. There are a few other faces that we can see, but they are significantly less dynamic, both in terms of empathy, looking at those facial features, the most exaggerated eyebrows, etc., but also in terms of temperature. This is really the only time we're going to see a really nice warm flesh tone on a face. The other times that we see a warm flesh tone, it's going to be covered up by the soldiers. This is also a good example of another technique for creating emphasis or a focal point, which is not just positioning, but this sort of eye direction that happens with an implied line. We're worried about him about to be shot. So we're using a focal point to get your attention, but we're also using a focal point to tie that attention directly to the content of the piece. We know that we are on the side of the martyrs from Spain and not those evil, oppressive French people, stupid French people.